Welcome to The Nature of Nurture with Dr. Leslie Carr, a podcast for your mental health. I'm your host, Leslie. If you're watching this podcast right now, you can find the audio version in any podcast app. And if you're listening, you can also watch this episode on YouTube at The Nature of Nurture. You can find that link in the show notes. Today, we're here to talk about the Akashic Records. In the last episode, I interviewed Scott Nathan about how a medium helped him find his birth family. And if you haven't checked that episode out yet, you might want to go and do it. I sometimes like to explore the elements of being alive that are not completely scientifically understood yet. And my conversation with Scott made me want to have someone on the show who can talk about the other side, so to speak. I suppose I mean that in more ways than one. I wanted to have someone on the show who knows what it's like to pull information from the other side of the veil in the way that a medium does. And I can't think of anyone better for that conversation than my very, very dear friend, Helen Vonderheide. Helen is not a medium, but she does something called reading the Akashic Records, which are a non-physical compendium of information. You'll hear us explore what that means in a minute, but we're in the territory of soul-level information here, so it's up to you if you find that interesting. I personally do. In addition to reading the records, Helen has been a certified teacher since 2015, so she also teaches other people to do this work, and she is a master-level practitioner. I first met her in 2019 when she and I had a one-on-one reading that absolutely blew my mind. Over the course of the past 4.5 years, I've gone on to have many, many more readings with her, and in 2020, I took one of her trainings on how to read the records myself, and in the process, we've become very close friends. I held this conversation from my home office, so you'll see me over there in a hot sec. In the meantime, please get ready for a very juicy conversation with the incomparable Helen Vonderheide. Hey there, Helen.
Hi, Leslie.
How you doing today?
Oh, I'm so well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I am so excited to be here with you right now, and I think we're going to have a lot of fun.
I feel the same way.
Cool.
I'm excited.
So let's start with a nice, big, broad question for everybody, because I think a lot of people are going to be listening to this that are kind of coming in cold here. But what are the Akashic Records?
Oh, the $1,000,000 question. So the word Akashic comes from the Sanskrit word Akasha, which means primary substance, that out of which all things are formed. So the Akashic Records are the vibrational record of a soul and its journey.
Beautiful. Will you say a little bit more about what that actually means, kind of like in practice, or how do we help people to understand what that actually means?
Yes. So if the word Akasha is primary substance, this primary substance is a formless field of consciousness, meaning it's non-physical. So as a practitioner, what I do is I consciously and deliberately access this non-physical field. And in this field, all of the impressions of a soul's journey start to come to life. It's almost as if they show up as visuals, images, symbols. But the primary way that I receive the Akashic Records is I'm clairaudient. So when we access this field of consciousness, there's supportive guiding forces that also become available. So supportive guiding forces meaning guides, maybe ancestors, that sort of thing. And then those guides will relay messages as well. And I hear them speak. And then I relate everything that they're saying, anything that they may be saying about these visuals, these symbols, or, whatever's coming alive in that unconscious field of consciousness. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I am relaying everything that they say.
Yeah, it's so You said so much that I want to dive into. And one of the things that I love about where you're starting and how we're starting to kind of pull these threads and explain this to people is the fact that you're kind of diving right in with the fact that you hear voices that are delivering this information to you. And in a minute, we'll kind of get into how you learned how to do this. But I just want to point out, because I find this so fascinating, as a psychologist, we live in a world where I think a lot of people have strong associations with what it means to have a person hear voices. And there's this feeling that I have of wanting to point out that a person can hear voices and not have them be um, a sign of insanity, or they're not. We're not talking about schizophrenia, we're not talking about command hallucinations, but we are talking about the fact that you hear voices.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
And Leslie, I think that's so interesting. I was talking to my sister the other day, and we were kind of talking about like an inner voice,
Yeah.
like an intuitive inner voice or an inner knowing. And she was telling me that there's some people that don't even experience that,
Yeah.
that don't have this kind of inner voice. And I would say that the voices that I hear, they're sort of like intuition. It's like an inner
Yeah.
knowing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is amazing to think. I know what you're talking about. And it's interesting to think that, I think greater than 50% of the population hears something resembling an internal monologue or, an internal dialogue, however it exactly shows up. And for anybody who has that, which is most of us, it's so hard to imagine that there are people who think without having that experience. But a lot of people, when they think and just are processing thoughts, it's not happening with language. But I think that actually is sort of comparable to what you're saying about how the information for you in this way. And in a moment, I want to ask you just a little bit about where we can kind of go a level deeper in terms of how did you learn how to do this and what are you actually experiencing when you do it. But in terms of what you're saying about how the information can show up in different ways, it's interesting to think that, you can get a clairaudient message, which is to say the sound of a voice in your head, if not multiple voices. We'll talk about that too. But you also can get visuals and felt sensory impressions, which I do think is quite analogous to how a lot of people experience thinking. You are doing more than just thinking when the records are open, but it is interesting to think that a lot of how human beings process information is sort of partially with, like, let's say, a feeling in your gut, partially with like the visuals that we take in from the outside world or the ones that exist in our mind's eye. And then there's all of like the sounds, the voices, like that kind of stuff that happen just as we're processing thoughts and feelings.
Yeah.
Kind of wild to think about.
Yeah.
So will you walk us through, how did you first discover that you had this gift?
I was just remembering, it's so fun. And I really appreciate our conversation just a moment ago because it actually reminded me of the first moment where something was alive inside of me. Like, I didn't quite yet know I could read the Akashic records, that I could access the Akashic records. But I remember probably about, I don't even know, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, before I actually learned how to read the Akashic records, I remember saying to myself, and I remember exactly where I was in the old place that I was living, but I just said to myself, I have such a wise inner voice that talks back to me. And I didn't know if that was a common thing for people to have. But I would have these thoughts, and then this wise voice would respond. And I was like, that's really interesting. And at that time, I just started to practice Buddhism,
Yeah.
so it was like, okay, I don't know what that is. But anyways, I'm going to forget about it. And I did. I forgot about it. And then several years went by, and I continued to practice Buddhism. And it was sort of like at the end of me practicing and at the beginning of when the Akashic records came into my life, I was chanting, and that's something that I did as I practiced Buddhism. And it felt like I had completely opened every part of my ability to sense energy, to
Yeah.
sense movement around me that was not physical movement. And as I was chanting, there's this little section of our prayers where we chant for people who have passed on. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember in that little section, I was chanting for people who were transitioning, actually. So I knew my grandmother, for example, was about to transition from her
Yeah.
physical life into her non-physical life, and I was chanting for her. And when I did, she responded back to me with like a really short, quick acknowledgement of the fact that like I was thinking of her and I kind of had her in these prayers. And um I might have just been chanting for her peaceful transition. And I think she said something along the lines of like, I'm okay now, and
Yeah.
like almost like it's all right now, I'm all right now. And I was like, oh my God, how do I come back to that? How can I communicate with like anyone that's like, on the other side transitioning? I had no exposure to this, Leslie, prior. I never had a psychic reading. I never had a tarot reading. I never had any kind of reading before. So that excitement that I felt to like continue making contact with something that I knew was there, I could very easily tell the difference between like what was my inner voice and then what is this other voice that's kind of coming outside and
Yeah.
just like fighting with mine. So at that point, I came upon the Akashic Records. A friend of mine had shared them with me and said, I think you might be into this.
Mm.
A friend of mine just learned how to read the records, get a reading. And I was like, yeah, I'm open. And I had an Akashic reading. And after I was done, I thought to myself, whoever this woman is talking to knows me better than I know myself.
Yeah.
And that was so healing.
Yeah.
The quality of healing that I experienced just through these statements or insights that were relayed to me just like immediately lifted me and made me feel lighter and more at peace and more free. And even I would say any limitation that made me feel like I can't do these things or I feel stuck here, all of that was lifted.
Yeah.
So that was my introduction to the Akashic Records.
Yeah. So wild. Will you tell us about how old you were back then? Because you probably were about 30, I'm guessing, just from knowing you.
Yeah, I think, yep. So I remember my first reading was in 2012.
Mm-hmm.
So at that time, you're absolutely right. I was 30.
Mm-hmm. Something feels so important to me about pointing that out that, you spent approximately 30 years on this planet kind of not understanding that you had gifts in this way. And then that started to open up for you. And I just think that as, I'm kind of imagining what the experience might be of some of the people who are listening to this. And I feel like, I don't know, I suppose we get there are some ideas that we have about people who have these kinds of gifts that it's almost like when you're a child, whether you have them or not, because there are some wild stories of like children having sort of spiritual experiences that are sort of inexplicable. Or I know that sometimes like mediums will have stories of like, oh, as a kid, I had these experiences, I didn't understand them. But you spent 30 years on this planet not knowing that you had access to these gifts.
I know. It's so, oh my God, it's so funny to
Hmm.
me because there was one moment I was raised Catholic,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a moment where I did know I had a connection to something. So this is probably when I was about like 7 or 8, and I was in church. I was
Mm.
looking at the priest at the front of the altar, and I just kept thinking, whoever he's in touch with, whatever he's communicating with, I have that same connection. The only
Mm.
difference, I don't need anything between me and that thing.
Oh,
I felt
beautiful.
like I can have a direct relationship with it, but it was it was sort of like a knowing that came to me, and then I didn't search, I didn't investigate it further.
Hmm.
But when I start to recount, like, was this gift there for me when I was younger? Like, was I talking to dead people when I was a kid? Like, look back on the timeline and say, no, the only thing I remember was that moment I was in church.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, so if we sort of zoom back to this point in history where you had your first Akashic reading and had this experience of feeling known in this very significant way, what happened next?
so, oh my goodness. A few things happened. So I didn't jump on it right away to learn how to read the records. I took that guidance and insight, I applied it to my life,
Mm,
and probably about, several months started to unfold where I was continually applying that insight to my life. And
okay.
I felt so taken care of in those several months. But
Hmm.
then I started to experience some new challenges. So I needed a
Hmm.
little bit more insight again. So I came back for another session, and the same thing, it was like a little bit of a pattern where I then was able to apply it for several months, and then I was like, okay, I need some more insight. It wasn't until my third session that I said to her, this is so healing and I want to do this for other people.
Mm,
She connected me with her teacher. At this point, it was Christina Cross, who's such an incredible Akashic Records teacher. And I took a beginning course with Christina. It was so easy because Christina, it was a weekend course and she just was like, learn this prayer. And that's how you're going to access your records. But once your records are open, you need to also translate and interpret the messages as they come through. But I was so fortunate where my clairaudience sense is, it's like fully turned on,
yeah,
it's like,
it's a real gift for you. Yeah.
yeah,
Hmm.
it's like
Hmm.
fully turned on. So, in the course, I was like, all right, so all I got to do is say this prayer, which did trip me up at first.
Yeah.
Because the
Hmm.
evolution of my spiritual journey is that eventually at some point, I outgrew Catholicism. I was ready
Hmm.
for what was next.
And
And that led
I just
really,
want to bridge a little something for listeners to make sure that that they're understanding what you're saying. But the original pathway prayer that you learned in order to open the records had the word God in it, which I know sort of
yeah,
tripped you up a little bit. It is not. It's not necessary that we say the word God when we're opening the records, but the prayer, so to speak, that you were taught contained that word. So I know that was a little triggering.
right. I know. I was
Hmm.
like, wait a minute, who, what? Because so much of my spiritual practice was evolving and I didn't know what God was anymore. I
Yeah.
didn't necessarily, fit into how I started to see my spiritual life or my spiritual practice,
Yeah.
because the next thing that came in was Buddhism, and then it was the Akashic Records, and Buddhism is just more about, unity, consciousness, that sort of thing, which actually at the end of the day, I would say, is an God is another word for that.
Yes.
So not as triggering, now that my practice has evolved. But
Mm.
after I got over the word, it's like, all right, let's say
Mhm.
this prayer. And I remember sitting in my bedroom. I said the prayer. Our homework was to go home and say the prayer. And I felt this opening in my crown. It was almost like two gates just like opened. And I felt all this energy rushing into my crown and like maybe just kind of out my like throat chest area,
Hmm.
almost like L shape. And I heard all of these voices and they were talking so fast. And I went back to my teacher the next day and I said, your prayer works, but there's too many and they talk too fast. And she said, ask them to speak as one and not ask them to slow down. And I was like, oh, I didn't know I could do that. So what I realized in that moment, Leslie, was if there's a really deliberate invocation that
Mm,
we can say to access this energy, it will access that energy. And that's what Linda's prayer gave me.
yeah.
The words in the prayer were this very high vibration that started to access
Mhm.
this non-physical field of consciousness. And
Yeah.
so the for me the prayer worked. I know that it doesn't work for everyone.
Mhm.
And I can say that as a teacher, having taught Linda's work for several years.
Mm.
Um, but when you're intentional and those intentions can act as an invocation, you can access this. You can access
Yeah,
the Akasha.
it's so incredible. You're saying a couple different things that I feel so excited about because on the one hand, I hear you that it is not just the intentionality of what you're saying, but the specific intentionality of even the energetic beings that you're calling in that you then have access to, right? So, for example, one of the things that has my attention right now is in Linda Howe's original prayer. It starts with, please correct me if I'm wrong based on your memory, but, and so we do acknowledge the forces of light. And one of the
Yeah.
things that I ended up learning over time is that you are acknowledging the forces of light because you do not want to acknowledge the forces of dark necessarily. You can,
Right.
there's, like you can do that as well. We can do that as well. But there is the specific intention of calling upon sort of divine guiding forces that are benevolent spirits that have your best interest in mind. And from there, you can even call upon specific bodies of energy like one's ancestors, like one's loved ones that have passed on. And so I just want to kind of clarify and emphasize that a little bit.
Yeah.
But the other thing that you said that I just think is really beautiful and powerful as I'm thinking about the bi-directional nature of this communication in the sense that in that very first lesson, you learned something really powerful that at this point I know is a very well honed gift because I've had so many readings with you and know you so well. But this idea of it's not just opening the records and then they just talk. It's like, you direct them, you ask specific questions that they can then shed their guidance. It's interesting to think about the bi-directional quality that I think is really just exemplified really beautifully by like, okay, I need you guys to slow down, speak as one voice because otherwise I can't understand what you're saying. It's like it's really a bi-directional relationship that you have with them.
Yeah. And it also makes me think about the kinds of questions that you ask. There
Yeah.
are questions that will yield more information and even more,
Mm-hmm.
not as more helpful information
Yes.
that can sort of, again, guide you in those, weeks, months ahead.
Mm-hmm.
So the best kinds of questions are anything that starts off with what, why, or how.
Mm-hmm.
You can ask anything and everything. Some people can say, I need a little bit of guidance in the area of profession.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that it has taken years and years of practice for me to hone that skill, to then just take an area, sort of, general, very vague, right? Because it's just like in the area of profession, and bring that to the records and then start to receive insight around it. But if you're starting off reading the records and you're wanting to receive a lot of information, helpful information, you can ask these questions that start off with what, why, or how. And what they do is they reveal the bigger picture
Yeah.
as opposed to um, should I, shouldn't I, which is like a
Mm-hmm.
yes or a no, which is
Mm-hmm.
really limited. It just it sort of keeps you only in that one thing that you're asking about. And you either get a yes or a no. And then from there, you kind of expand out. Whereas if you reworded it to start off with what, why, or how, you'll get the answer to that yes or no question, and you'll get so much more.
Right.
They'll reveal, like, the whole picture around whatever it is you're inquiring about.
Yeah, you're leading me right to something that I think is a really important part of this conversation, which is like, what is the point of any of this? It's sort of interesting to think that if we were to never talk about the deeper meaning or the bigger picture, we ultimately could be talking about parlor tricks, right? Like, so Helen, you can communicate with the divine. How wonderful for you. But it's like, what really are we all doing here, right? What's the point of doing this work or having this conversation? And I'm thinking about the learning and the growth that comes from our ability to access this information, either for ourselves or with the help of someone like you that can help access it. And I guess just to sort of bridge us into a question, I'm just sort of thinking about the sort of what, why, how. Were those the three words you used? Yeah, because as
Yeah.
we could probably get into a little bit, when is a notoriously bad question. They will never, they have a notoriously bad understanding of time and will not be able to answer when related questions. But as we ask what, why, and how questions, they're able to reveal things like what we're meant to be learning from a certain situation, perhaps where our attention or our focus should be. And I
Yeah.
wonder if you want to help people to understand a little bit about that piece, like the learning and the growth that can happen in the records and this sort of zoomed out perspective of what all of this is, what either all of this is for or what all of it is about, right?
Yeah. So the question is so beautiful, Leslie. And I have a real life experience, and I'm going to put that off to the side. And I think that would be helpful to
Okay.
come back.
Mm,
But I want to break down why even access the records.
right.
So the Akashic records are comprised of two parts. The first is the soul blueprint. Those are the lessons and the themes that we learn and grow from in
Mm,
our life experience. So, regardless if you believe in this or not, what I'm sure we can all get behind is the fact that we learn and grow and we evolve. That's,
mm.
the nature of us. And then the Akashic records, knowing that one part of the records is the soul blueprint, we can actually find out what are those life learnings? What are those themes? How are we growing in this incarnation? So
Mm,
that becomes a resource for us should someone be curious or be seeking their own personal growth. The other set of the records is the Chronicles of You, and I like to compare that to your free will and choice.
mm.
So if you find out what you are learning,
Yeah.
it can help inform the choices that you're making around around those lessons.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, here's where the real life experience gets to come in. My partner and I are in the process of putting in an offer in on a home.
Mm,
And when it first came into our awareness, we didn't have all the pieces in place. And we just thought, okay, you know what? This was just a learning experience for us to get all the pieces in place. We're not in a position to make an offer.
mm.
Lo and behold, 2 weeks later, this house is like still coming for us. Like it, it almost feels like the house is like, make an offer on me. Like I'm like,
Mm,
why is
mhm.
this house coming back to us? I thought it was dead. I thought the possibility was dead. But then Mike and I thought, well, you know what? Let's check the records. let's see what the records have to say specifically around what we're learning. Are we just learning that we need to have all the things in place?
Sometimes they can be very practical.
Are that this is just something that we invest into as a bridge to get us from where we're living now, into the next thing, and then ultimately into the next thing. Who knows, right? But Mike and I can't see, why does this house keep coming back into our awareness? And when we did see it, I was like, are we buying a house today? Actually, I'm sorry, this is before we even saw the house in person. I was like, Mike, are we buying a house today? So there was this instinct inside, that was leading me, both of us, to this property, to something about this property, this house, this possibility. But now, because it's already been a couple weeks, we think it's really important to consult the records. And so the first thing that I do, Leslie, that I'm going to do, I haven't done yet, is I'm going to ask, what are we learning? What's the growth here for us?
Yes.
And also stay unattached to this house as the house. That is the most important thing. So then from there, what choices Mike and I make, they're more informed choices. So if this was just for us to get our, things in
mortgage
place here,
approved. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
If that's really what it's about, then we let the house go and we keep looking,
Yeah.
So that's helpful in terms of how the records are, structured into these two parts. And then how it can really help inform all the choices that you're making. And I would just say that the last thing around, like, why even access the records, if someone has a growth mindset, the records can be an incredibly resourceful tool.
Yeah.
And I think about that because there's a negative bias that our mind tends to lean into. And so what Mike and I leaned into initially around this house was fear, limitation, contraction. We don't know if we should make an offer. We need to work on all these things. But then I was like, okay, that choice right now, it's coming from a place of fear. And I know the records. They always encourage us to come from a place of love. Make your decisions from a place of love. Make your choices from a place of trust. So it's a little bit Mike and I have to dive into this a little bit deeper because we still want to make as much as an informed choice as we possibly can.
I think what you're saying is so important. And part of what it's making me think about, anyone who has been, if people have listened to previous podcast episodes of mine, or if they followed my work in any way, this will not be the first time they've heard me say this, but you're teeing me right up to it. And I think in a very important, significant way, which is the idea of looking at our lives through the lens of learning and growth, just the sort of what are we learning from the experiences that we're having. And something that I think is so important from a mental health point of view, it's interesting to think that we can think about this stuff spiritually in the way that you are right now. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Or for people who are a little bit less spiritually oriented, you can think about it in a way that's purely psychological and just related to your mental health. It is a huge and powerful reframe to think about the things that we're going through in life through the lens of what we're learning and how we're growing and what those experiences are teaching us. And I think that you're saying something really significant about the soul level journey of what it means to be alive, because something that I want to kind of point out to people is that it is implicit in the notion of the Akashic records and the way that they work, that reincarnation is sort of part of this way of thinking. It is, the idea is that we are souls in addition to being bodies. We have been incarnated before. We most likely will be incarnated again. And we have learned lessons from the last journey that are loading into this journey. And then here we are in this life experience learning new lessons, fine tuning old lessons, getting do-overs on things. And I just think that what you're saying is really important, that the records can sometimes be very practical. Sometimes they will say, you need to get your mortgage paperwork in order, but they are also able to provide this really expansive, zoomed out view, which is, where is the learning and the growth for you here? And for anyone who is sort of interested in this modality and this tool, this like set of tools, that's a lot of what this is all about, right? Is sort of just trying to figure out where the learning and the growth is.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the way that you said that, because a lot of the times I'll call the Akashic records just this Akashic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get the Akashic perspective on that.
Yeah.
And, and it's one perspective in addition to multiple perspectives that we can get.
Yes.
Families, advisors, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, or even sort of like, I know you and I have talked about this so many times over the course of, many years now, phone calls, etc. Just like this idea that we are also having a very unique experience of being incarnated on this planet. And that comes with its own wisdom and its own perspective that they don't always have a really clear view into, in terms of these beings that are on the other side of the veil that we're consulting and getting wisdom from. Some of them have been incarnated before. Some of them have not. I think sometimes, even if they have been incarnated before, sometimes it can feel a little bit like, it's been a while. It's been a while since you've been subjected to the feeling of gravity and had to sort of navigate, this sort of slow way in which things can sometimes feel on planet Earth. But so that the duality of that, I think, is so valuable, right? Like in empowering ourselves as humans, because we do possess both. We all have, whether we have access to it or not, or are listening to it or not, we all have soul level guidance inside of us, nudges, winks, we experience synchronicities and that kind of stuff. And we also are having the somewhat trudging experience of being human, which is its own thing. I know there's not a question in there, but I wonder if you want to respond to that.
I loved it, because I was circulating all the thoughts of yes, being this human experience, just being in a body, having some outside perspective on it, an outside perspective that's very elevated, that has a bird's eye view.
Yeah, bird's eye view is a really good way to put it.
Right.
So, and we'll get more into the body and the wisdom that holds in a little bit. But you said something else that I want to come back to, which is the idea of sort of the soul having a blueprint. And I feel like you're saying something really important about the distinction between these things, that we come into our lives with something resembling a blueprint for, perhaps, like, let's say, the overarching lessons that we're meant to learn in this lifetime, the skills, the abilities, the gifts that we have access to, and that kind of stuff. And then there is also free choice and places where we get to make decisions. But can you tell everybody a little bit about sort of how those two things interplay and about the soul blueprint level of things?
Yes, yeah. I always find it helpful to use my real life experiences around these things. But in particular, what I'm thinking about is a relationship. It was a romantic relationship. And, this is probably 10 years ago. Who
Earmuffs,
knows?
Mike. Just in case Mike's listening. Mike, you can turn it off now. Just kidding.
Oh my God. But and this is pretty early on in my I'm so sorry, in my relationship with the Akashic Records. This is pretty early on in my relationship with the Akashic Records. And so there was a person that I was dating, and I have this tendency in my younger years to get really attached to a relationship, very attached to the person, attached to the relationship, and I hold on really tight. And even when the relationship isn't supposed to work out, I'm always like, no, don't take it away from me. But I remember my record. Okay, so I thought, you know what? here's this relationship. There's some challenges. I'm going to consult my records about it.
Mm.
What's their perspective? What's their take on it? One of the first things they told me, this relationship is lesson specific and it's teaching you to let go. And I was like, oh,
Wow.
that's so helpful, because up until that point, my pattern was to, like
hold on real tight, right? Yeah.
So this relationship is only in my life to teach me to let go. I felt like at that point, when I had received that insight, I was like, let go, Helen.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm so grateful that I did, because not only did I know I was holding on really tightly, that translated into my body. There was so much tension in my body, because when you think about something you're holding on to, relationship or even something physical, it's like your muscles are even sort of contracting so that you can like grip whatever it is you're gripping. And the moment I let go of that, I just even felt more of a sense of freedom in my physical body, emotionally, mentally, physically. And I was like, all right, great. Like, I don't need to hold on. So
Mm-hmm.
that was really helpful for me. And then how that also, just in terms of, how the records are comprised in these two parts, the moment I received that insight around that lesson, that it's a lesson specific, letting go thing, I immediately made the choice to let go. My mind made the decision. Do not hold on. This
Mm-hmm.
is just a lesson. So
Mm-hmm.
that's how easily it can translate with the choices that we make. That doesn't mean that letting go can be easy for, whatever the lesson is,
Mm-hmm.
for anyone. It doesn't mean that it's easier to do what they're
Sure.
suggesting or may be guiding,
Mm-hmm. It's not
because
always going to
they're
be fun.
right. Because there have
Mm-hmm.
there have been many times after that time where here's another example. My dog bit me, and I was hospitalized because the bite had an infection.
Mm.
And when I got out of the hospital, I had to have hand surgery.
I
I
remember
asked,
this. Yeah.
yeah, I asked my records, what should I do? And they said, you're not going to like what we have to say, but you need to put him down. And
Yeah.
I was like, I don't like what you have to say. And please help me do whatever I can do to help my dog. And they gave me suggestions, Leslie, work with a trainer, dog Reiki, bring him to the vet, get everything checked out. I did all the things, but a month later we had to put him down because
Mm-hmm.
he had
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
another person.
Oh yeah.
So that was just an instance of, this is not an easy thing I did go to you for your advice. It's not an easy thing that you're advising me to do. I can't do it right now, but unfortunately, and at the same time, I'm so grateful that the friend that he did bite was not as bad as mine. She still did get bit, which is unfortunate, but had I listened to them sooner, there's a possibility that nobody else would have gotten hurt, by him.
Yeah. Isn't that amazing? It's like sometimes they're going to say things you don't want to hear.
Right.
And going back to just sort of the notion of a soul blueprint for a moment, can you speak a little bit to the idea of the sort of larger lessons that some people can sometimes be? I'm hesitant to use the word destined, but let's say like destined to learn, or like the idea of like the big life lessons you maybe what a person can be
Yes.
incarnated to learn.
Yes. I love the way that they talk about the soul blueprint, because it's always themes,
Mm.
and those themes can translate into lessons. So for example, again, this is my personal experience of it. My partnering journey, romantic partnering journey, had really been quite a journey.
Mm.
I'm 43 now, and have finally connected and am settling into a life partnership with um, Mike. And so what's interesting is my records told me in my partnering journey, my partnering path,
Mhm.
I'm learning two like lessons, two themes. It was themes. Self-care and well, I guess it was three. It was like self-care, self-love, self-acceptance.
Mm.
And then the way those themes translate is into these life lessons. So, for example, that person that I was dating when I first started working the records and the lesson was to let go, the way that self care, self love, self acceptance was manifesting as a lesson was in this with this person and letting go. And I wouldn't even say that it was about that person, but it was letting go and being unattached in general.
Mm,
So
mhm.
here's how these themes manifest as lessons. And it doesn't matter how many people it takes, Helen, until you get that, you may not be able to fully settle into the kind of life partnership that you are wanting to experience. So it doesn't mean that I'll never get a relationship or I won't have, whatever it is I'm looking for in a relationship. But what it means is that through those themes and those lessons, I'm starting to grow and evolve. And then I get to that point in my journey where everything aligns and it makes sense. And then I just know I'm, meant to be with that person, so to speak. So s- specifically around self-care, um, my records were very blunt with me and said that when I get into relationships, I really put that person first and I don't take care of myself.
Mm.
And they even told me when I met Mike, because I was like, what lessons am I learning in this? I remember them being like self-care. Like, this is a really huge part of your
Mm.
wellness, Helen. You always love to, baby and take care of your partners, but like that can't happen. Like, you got to do that for yourself. So naturally what happened is that my self-care started to, slowly drift out of frame when I was with Mike. And then I remembered, you know, it starts to show up as emotional and like mental dysregulation for me when I
Mm.
don't engage in my self-care practices. So when I started to see those things going a little out of whack, I remembered that they had told me self-care is something that I'm learning. And I was like, all right, I need to come back to it. So
Mhm.
it's really just making sure, and then self-acceptance is just that it's like, I don't need to, I get to just be me, I don't need to do anything more.
Mhm.
I don't need to be anything more. I don't need to be anyone. I get to really just be myself and accept that
Mm.
who
Mm.
I am is who I am, and that's enough for my partnership. And so you start to see how those things manifest. And then from there, you just continually use those as ways to guide yourself back to
Mm.
those themes, those lessons. So it kind of acts as like a personal practice at that point. It's like, my self-care, my self-acceptance, self-love, like they started to become spiritual practices for me.
Yeah, it's incredible. I think that that is not only a really good example, but I'm thinking about the pieces of this that inevitably show up in people's lives, even when they haven't had access to the records. And this isn't a way in which they've been thinking, because I think a lot of people can relate to the idea. And it's so funny because maybe they've never had this zoomed out perspective before. Maybe they've never known that they could get access to this information, that there can be this feeling like you're almost beating your head against a wall because life has a way of continually giving you the same lesson over and over again. It's like, for so many people, if they're single and dating, they can come to feel like they're dating the same mistake over and over again in different people's bodies, or like it's that there can be this feeling sometimes of, life trying to get your attention. And at first it's whispering, but if you don't listen to the whisper, it starts to talk a little louder. And the next thing you know, it's like yelling if you're not paying attention. And the thing that I'm thinking about more than anything is, and if you want, I can give you an example, but I'm thinking about the idea that not everybody engages with the learning or the lessons, and not everybody is sort of doing the work. And I wonder if you can speak to that a little bit, that it
Yeah.
isn't necessarily inevitable that we're going to be learning.
Right. Leslie, I think about that often. Sometimes I'm like, gosh, it seems like it's so easy for so and so, but yet I'm over here having to, work with the records around my handicaps. It's like they are spiritual handicaps, spiritual human disconnects. And from that perspective, sometimes I feel like, gosh, why do I have to work so hard? Or like, why isn't it like that for everyone? But I think personally, what I've come to realize is everybody's journeys are so different. Not everybody is approaching life from a place of growth and learning.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I have been in relationships where people do not approach their relationships from a place of learning and growth. And those relationships have been very difficult for me to stay in, because you kind of come up against their, you come up against whatever their limitation or their block is around their own, self-reflection, inner growth. And if there's not a willingness to kind of take responsibility for themselves in the relationship that you have with them, then there's really nowhere for that relationship to go. And so a lot of the times what I've had to do is just let go of relationships, or
Right.
let go of them to the extent that, maybe the depth of the relationship that I thought I could have with them, I can't. And it just needs to be a little bit more surface level.
Yeah. I think this is, I think we're in really important territory, because I'm sort of thinking about the notion of what we call codependency in the world of, psychology and pop psychology, which is just to sort of make it clear for people. Sometimes, so a painful example that's coming up for me is I think about addiction. Like if somebody is active in their addiction to something, and they are, let's say, not wanting to learn the lessons that are right in front of them. And I think we all know what this is like. I think we all have had at least one person in our lives that seems to be living out a really painful incarnation. And if we're doing our own work, sometimes there can be a temptation to almost overcompensate and want to sort of participate in the other person, like to try to, like, let's say, make them pay attention, make them learn the lesson that's right in front of them. And I think that it can be a very painful thing to have to recognize that you're not responsible for anybody else's learning and anybody else's growth. And sometimes we have to choose ourselves, right? I'm sort of hearing that even in what you were saying with the framing things through the lens of self-care for yourself, that it sort of seems like part of what you have had to learn in your own life. And as I'm thinking about people who have struggled with loving people that have addictions and that kind of stuff, there are other people in my life that are coming to mind, but it feels like part of what you have had to learn is just to choose yourself. And I think that there are versions of that lesson that I think a lot of us struggle with, which is sort of, how do we keep our eyes on our own paper and sort of stay focused on our own learning and the lessons that we're meant to live in this lifetime, and to not have our eyes on somebody else's paper because they can only be learning their own lessons.
Yes. The records have also talked about accepting and loving that person for where they're at on their journey.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes I would imagine letting go, right? Like knowing when you have to sometimes cut ties, or
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, they've just kind of been so helpful around, everybody is on their own journey and it looks the way that it looks. And as you just touched on, it's not your responsibility to change it. It's not your responsibility to help that person. Like, stay in your lane, Helen. And that also for me tends to be a really huge relief, because I think my inclination is to be as helpful and supportive as I can. And a lot of that comes from, I would say that's just who I am in general. When I was growing up, I wanted to be like an altar girl, like I wanted to volunteer, I wanted to be in service. I just always have wanted to be in service. And that can show up in ways that tend to become unhealthy for me. And if I can learn to just accept and like let go of whatever potential exists in a relationship, then it's healthier for me. It's healthier for that person. They get to be on their own journey.
Right. Yeah. Well put. I have one last kind of question / set of questions I want to ask you, because it's a big topic area. But I'm thinking about the notion of evidence for the records and or skepticism. Like, I'm imagining if there are any hardcore skeptics out there, they're probably not still listening. So I think we can afford to assume that we're pretty much preaching to the choir at this point. But I know that scientific validation around the records is something that's inherently interesting to you. And I was having a conversation with a friend recently about the idea of kind of whether evidence for this kind of stuff exists. And before I actually ask a question, I just want to preface it by saying that I think one of the things that has compelled me so much around this work is that I certainly have had my own experience of feeling like I have found evidence in the work, meaning that the quality of guidance that I've gotten from my sessions with you, or the work that I do now opening my own records and that kind of thing, I am somewhat obviously here from a place of not feeling doubtful about this work and the powerful and fundamental truth that I think that it holds. But if you were to think for a moment about anyone who might be sort of skeptical that any of this is real, how do you think about that stuff? Like, do you even have a story or an anecdote that you would like to share from a time where information came through and then there was kind of irrefutable evidence that the information that came through was real?
Yes. This is when I was in my teacher training, Akashic Record teacher training, and I had to do some practice sessions to, as part of the requirement. And one of my business partners at the time, what is it called? Not agnostic, atheist. He was and probably still is atheist. But I was like, hey, can I do this practice session on you? I just need to get these practice sessions under my belt for my teacher certification. And he's like, sure, but I'm atheist, like I don't believe in any of this.
Good luck.
I'm like, well, yeah, like no pressure. Let me just do my thing and we'll see what happens. So he had lost a very, very dear friend of his. His friend transitioned, and I didn't know that going into our session. And when I opened up his records, that friend came through, still unbeknownst to me. But I relayed this message from this person, and my friend broke down in tears. And he said, I think you're talking to my friend. Can you ask if this is him? So I asked, is this that friend? And I got a confirmation, like, yes, this is me. And my friend was in tears the entire session. And, like I said, he's probably still atheist, and that's perfectly fine. Right. But you can't deny the experience that you have when you make contact with it. So a lot of the time, the skepticism comes from probably a place of fear, not
Mm.
like, oh, I'm afraid of this thing, or I'm afraid of talking to my friend who's passed on, but um, probably in that we're starting to access this infinite cosmic intelligence. It's so vast that can be fearful. Like, what are you going to access when you go into my Akashic records? Who's going to come through? What's going to come through? What are you going to learn about me? Like, are you going to read my soul? Are you reading my thoughts? Like, there, it feels like there's a gamut of questions that somebody could have, with the possibility of this. And so, in terms of skepticism, what comes to mind is um, maybe you have had an experience and this is bullshit, oh,
Oh, it's okay.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
And
You're fine.
right, it's like, I've had the experience, I know this doesn't work, and that's fine. Like, that was your experience and you are entitled to it. But if you don't have that experience and you're still a skeptic, well, I don't know. I just think like that seems a little unfair to you to not give yourself at least the experience to consider, is this thing valid or not? But then the other thing I wanted to add is Irvin Laszlo, he's a physicist,
Mm.
and they have actually found validity in the Akashic records in quantum physics. So in quantum physics, they call the Akashic field the 0 point field, or ZPF for short. And essentially what they say is it is this field of consciousness that underlies space itself, where all things arise, atoms, molecules, cells, human beings. And so they, they have found the equivalent. And I would say the Akashic records are really, really looking at this field through a spiritual lens.
It's really, I love the way that you're putting this, because I think that one of the things that's so interesting to me is I'm just sort of thinking about how some people, I think for their own psychological comfort, perhaps feel the need to know that the reality that they have been experiencing their whole lives is the sum total of reality, and there can't be anything other than that is possible. There's an anxious element to it, I think, where I think when some people are a little bit more anxiously oriented, there's a feeling of needing to be certain. And I hear you that, if we were to look at things through the lens of quantum physics, we can see that we live in a wildly mysterious universe that in many ways we still barely understand. And I love what you're saying about the scientific validity. I would love to get that information from you, and I'll add it to the show notes. But I think that it's just really well put. And thank you for that. So
You're
I
welcome.
obviously could have this conversation with you. I could keep talking for like 4 more hours. In the interest of time, I think what we should do is draw it to a close. But I just want everybody to know that there are lots of ways of engaging with the work that you do, because people can book private sessions with you. They can also work with you to learn how to read the records themselves. I've already explained to everybody that that's a big part of what you do. But so I take it that everyone can go to helenvonderheide.com, right?
Yes.
I will put that link in the show notes too. And is there anything else you want people to know, that anything that we haven't touched upon today that you have a burning desire to share with people before we go?
There is just one final thought, and I share this with our friends who are tuning in. If anything we talked about sparked something inside of you, I just want to encourage them to lean into it, learn a little bit more. That's such a beautiful way that the records speak through us and to us, is when there's a resonance and
Yeah.
it's like, I don't know a lot about this, but I feel something alive in me around it. And so I just want to encourage that. And I know there's so many resources out there. I did mention my teacher, Linda Howe, who wrote an extraordinary book. I think it's how to access the Akashic records, how to read the Akashic
so.
records.
I'll put it in the show notes. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's a really great resource to turn to learn a little bit more. And Leslie and I were talking about this earlier. It's digestible. It's approachable.
Yeah.
It's easy to read.
It is. It's a fantastic book on this topic. And I really hear what you're saying, that I think for a lot of people, there may just be a feeling of some degree of resonance, or I want to learn more about this. And I hope that if anyone feels that way, that they'll explore it, because it's pretty cool stuff. So thank you so much, Helen, for doing this with me.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you so much. This was such a delight to be with you, to be with anybody who's tuning in. I'm so grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, I could talk about this with you all day. Thanks. You've been watching or listening to The Nature of Nurture with me, Dr. Leslie Carr, and I want to thank you for joining us. You can find Helen at helenvonderheide.com, and she's at Helen Vonderheide on Instagram. You can find both of those links in the show notes. If you want to find me, I'm at Dr. Leslie Carr on Instagram, and you can also find me at lesliecarr.com. Many thanks to Helen for having this conversation with me, and to all the people who worked behind the scenes to make this happen. Full credits can be found in the show notes. If you found this conversation valuable, please let me know by leaving a review or rating, or by sharing the episode with at least one person who you think might enjoy it too. You can also like or subscribe on YouTube or in any podcast app that you can get your hands on. Thank you again for tuning in. I'll see you next time.